The peace envoy from Earth was named Aris Halden, and on the morning the Dominion killed him, he was 31 years old and smiling at the wrong people. He had been chosen for that smile. In the long deliberations that had preceded first contact with the sovereign dominion of the Veil, the councils of humanity had argued for 100 nights about who should carry the olive branch into the throne halls of a power that outnumbered them 1,000 to 1. In the end, they had not sent their oldest or their proudest. They had sent Aris because he laughed easily, because he listened before he spoke, because when he stood, he did not seem to occupy the room so much as offer it to whoever else was standing there. He was the kind of man other men trusted with their children. That was precisely the quality the councils wanted the Veil to see. Look, humanity meant to say, look how gentle we can afford to be. The Veil saw it and read it as weakness, and that reading would cost them everything. The Dominion's central world was called Ashvar, a planet strangled in cities, its native oceans long since roofed over with spires of black glass that climbed until the horizon curdled with them. From orbit it looked like a wound that had grown teeth. Aris arrived aboard a single unarmed courier, a slim vessel with Earth's blue mark on the hull, and he was met not by ambassadors but by soldiers, and he did not let his smile falter even then. He had trained for this. He knew the Veil prized composure, the way other species prized gold. He walked between their honor guard with his hands open at his sides, and his gifts carried behind him in cases of plain gray polymer. And he thought, those who reconstructed his last hours believe he thought, that this was the beginning of something. It was, just not the something he imagined. The sovereign of the Veil was a creature called Uthras-Vo, and he received the human envoy from a throne grown out of the living rock of Ashvar, a chair that was less furniture than geology, a thing that had swallowed 9 previous sovereigns and would swallow this one too when his time came. Uthras-Vo was old in the way empires are old, which is to say he had stopped counting his enemies because there had ceased to be any that frightened him. He looked down at the small, warm-blooded thing that Earth had sent, and he was insulted. He had expected a warlord. He had expected, at the very least, a delegation heavy with the trappings of consequence, fleets in escort, threats wrapped in courtesy, the whole grammar of one power addressing another. Instead, a single man had come, alone, unarmed, offering gifts. To Uthras-Vo this meant only one thing. It meant Earth did not consider the Dominion worth fearing. It meant these humans were either fools or, worse, that they genuinely did not understand the shape of the galaxy they had wandered into, that they thought kindness was a currency here. "You come to us empty-handed," Uthras-Vo said, and his voice filled the hall the way water fills a drowning man's lungs. Aris bowed. The translators rendered his words a half-second behind his lips. "I come to you with open hands, sovereign. It is not the same as empty. I bring the greetings of 11 billion people, and their hope that our peoples might know each other before we ever have cause to fear each other." A rustle passed through the court. Among the Veil, to speak of fear in a sovereign's presence was to name a thing that did not exist. Uthras-Vo let the silence stretch. Then he did something that the human could not have anticipated, because no human mind, however well briefed, could truly hold the arrogance of a being who had never once in his long life been told no. "You speak of fear," the sovereign said, "as though it were a thing your kind could give or withhold. Let me show you what fear is. Let me send it home in a box, so that your 11 billion may open it and understand." Aris Halden's smile finally faltered then. Not from cowardice, the records are very clear on this, and humanity would build monuments to the fact, but from a dawning, terrible comprehension. He understood in the last minute of his life that he had not been received as an envoy at all. He had been received as a message. The Veil had already decided before his courier ever cleared their outer buoys that first contact with humanity would be an occasion to demonstrate the Dominion's supremacy. And a live diplomat sent home humbled was a weaker demonstration than a dead one sent home in pieces. He might have run. There was nowhere to run. He might have begged. He did not. What he did, in the recordings the Veil themselves broadcast, for they were proud of this, they wanted the galaxy to see, was straighten his back and look up at the geological horror of that throne and say, in a voice that did not shake, "My people did not send me because we are weak. They sent me because we hoped you were strong enough not to need this. I see now that we were wrong about you. I am sorry for what my death is going to cost you. It will cost you more than you can possibly imagine." The court laughed. That laughter, too, was broadcast. Then Uthras Vo gestured, and the honor guard that had walked Eris Halden into the hall closed around him, and the transmission from Ashvar showed the galaxy exactly what the Dominion did to the ambassadors of species who did not know their place. It was not quick. It was designed not to be quick. And when it was finished, the Veil gathered the remains of the man Earth had trusted with its open hand, and they placed those remains in one of his own gray gift cases, and they programmed his courier to carry it home on automatic pilot, and they broadcast the coordinates of its arrival to 200 worlds so that everyone would be watching when it came. It arrived at the edge of the Sol system 19 days later. The young woman who was on watch when Eris Halden came home was named Kessa Orden, and she was 26 years old, and she was a strategic officer 3rd class aboard the human perimeter station Meridian, and for the rest of the galaxy's history, her name would be spoken in the same breath as the reckoning that followed. But on that day she was nobody. She was a junior analyst with good instincts, and a habit of asking questions her superiors found tiresome, and she was drinking cold synthetic coffee and watching a sensor board when the courier tripped the outer array. She recognized the transponder before the computer did. Everyone on Meridian had memorized that transponder. It belonged to the ship that had carried humanity's hope out into the dark, and its return, weeks ahead of any possible schedule, meant that the mission had ended one way or another. "Contact," Kessa said, and her voice was very steady, and later she would not remember making it steady. "It's the Envoy's courier, coming in on automatic, no response to hail." The watch commander came to look over her shoulder. The station's senior staff were summoned. And because the Veil had broadcast the courier's coordinates to 200 worlds, half the galaxy was already watching their feeds when Meridian brought the little ship into its docking cradle, and opened it and found the gray case waiting inside, and found what the Veil had left in it, and found the recording they had left playing on a loop so that the humans would understand precisely what had been done and precisely why. Kessa Orden was in the docking bay when they opened the case. She had not been ordered there. She had gone because some part of her needed to see, needed to make the thing real, needed to refuse the easy comfort of second-hand horror. She was young enough to still believe that looking away from a thing was a kind of lie, so she looked. And what she saw in that gray polymer case rearranged something in her at a level below thought, below grief, below even rage. It went down to the place where a person's fundamental sense of how the universe was ordered lives, and it took hold of that sense, and it broke it cleanly, the way a bone breaks, and set it again into a new and colder shape. She did not weep. Others wept. Kessa Orden stood very still and watched the Veil's recording play its loop, watched Uthras Vo lean down from his throne of swallowed sovereigns and laugh, and she felt the grief pass through her and out the other side and become something with edges. She was a strategic officer. She had spent her whole short career learning to think in terms of systems and pressures and consequences, learning to see the hidden architecture beneath events. And standing in that docking bay, she did the thing she had been trained to do, the only thing she knew how to do with pain. She began, quite calmly, to think about what the Veil had just shown her. They had shown her their arrogance. That was the surface of it, and the surface was what the councils and the news feeds and the grieving billions would fixate on. But Kessa was looking beneath the surface, and beneath the arrogance she saw something far more useful. She saw a mistake. Uthras Vo had believed he was demonstrating strength. What he had actually demonstrated was the exact anatomy of his own certainty, the assumptions on which the entire Dominion rested. He had told humanity, in the clearest possible language, that the veil could not conceive of being answered. Their whole strategic posture, their fleets, their 200 subject worlds, the terror they exported like a commodity, all of it was built on the axiom that no one who was struck by the Dominion could strike back in any way that mattered. It was not merely that they thought themselves stronger than any given enemy. It was that they had forgotten, across the long centuries of unchallenged rule, what it even felt like to be afraid. Fear was a language they no longer spoke. And a power that cannot feel fear, cannot see the thing that is coming to kill it. That was the mistake, that was the crack in the black glass. Kessa Orden filed it away, in that cold, new-shaped place inside her, and she made herself a promise she did not speak aloud, because speaking it would have made it smaller. She promised the dead man in the gray case that she would teach the veil the word they had forgotten. Not all at once, not in a spasm of vengeance that would burn out and leave the Dominion standing and humanity spent. She would teach it to them slowly and precisely, the way you teach a hard lesson to someone who has never once had to learn anything. She would give them the whole of it, every syllable, and she would make certain that the last thing Uthras Vo ever understood was that he had done this to himself. She was 26. She had no fleet, no rank to speak of, no authority to promise any such thing. What she had was a mind that had just been broken and reset into a shape the galaxy had never seen before, and a grief that had finished burning and left behind something that would not go out. It would be enough. In time, it would be more than enough. The councils of humanity in the days that followed did what councils do. They raged. They mourned. They convened emergency sessions and issued denunciations and demanded, from a Dominion that did not deign to answer, an accounting that would never come. There were factions who wanted immediate war, and factions who counseled that war was suicide, and both factions were correct, which is the particular hell of any real decision. Humanity's fleets were formidable by the standards of a young species, but they were a candle held up to the Dominion's bonfire. Everyone who ran the numbers arrived at the same place. A direct war against the Veil would end with Earth's cities roofed over in black glass, or gone. And so the councils argued, and the days became weeks, and the terrible momentum of the atrocity began, as such momentum does, to slow. The feeds moved on. The grief settled from a fire into a permanent low ache. The pragmatists began, gently at first and then less gently, to speak the words that pragmatists always eventually speak. That perhaps the wisest course was endurance, that a wound survived was better than a war lost, that Aris Halden would not have wanted his death to become the death of his species. They were not cowards, the people who said these things. Many of them were the bravest sort of people, the kind who are brave enough to be hated for saying what is true. The truth was that humanity could not fight the Dominion and win. Everyone who looked at the problem honestly saw that. Everyone except a 26-year-old strategic officer third class, who had looked at the same problem and seen something no one else had thought to look for. Kessa Orden did not believe humanity could fight the Dominion and win. She had never believed that, not for a single hour. She agreed with the pragmatists completely on the facts and not at all on the conclusion. Because the pragmatists were answering the question, can we defeat their strength? And Kessa had stopped asking that question in the docking bay. She was asking a different one, a question that no one else in the whole grieving apparatus of humanity had thought to ask, because it required first believing something that seemed insane. Her question was this: what if you did not have to defeat their strength at all? What if their strength was not the thing that held the Dominion together? What if it was only the thing everyone was looking at? An empire of 200 worlds is not, in the end, held together by its fleets. It is held together by belief, by the certainty of the subject worlds that resistance is pointless, by the certainty of the Dominion's own officers that their sovereign is invincible, by the great humming machinery of confidence that lets a few million Veil rule a galaxy's worth of the conquered. Take away the fleets, and the Dominion is still standing. But take away the belief, surgically, precisely, in exactly the right places, and the fleets become metal that does not know it has already lost. That was the thing Kessa Orden had seen in the black glass throne room. That was the crack. And in the weeks while her elders argued themselves toward endurance, she sat in her quarters aboard Meridian and did not sleep very much, and she began to draw the shape of a weapon that had never existed before. It was not a bomb or a fleet or a virus. It was a plan. A long, patient, exact plan, with the dead man's promise written under every line of it. She did not yet have a name for the thing. The name would come later, and it would come from the enemy's own mouth, and that would be the first joke of the reckoning, though no one was laughing yet. She would give it a name that sounded like the end of the world. She would make it, instead, the end of exactly one thing. The plan that Kessa Orden drew in the sleepless weeks aboard Meridian was, at first, only a hypothesis, and she knew better than to bring a hypothesis to people who wanted certainties. So she did something that would have gotten her disciplined if anyone had understood what she was doing. She stopped submitting her analyses through channels and started building a case in silence, the way a prosecutor builds a case against a man too powerful to be arrested until every piece is in place. She needed 3 things, and she went after them in order. The first thing she needed was to be believed by exactly one person who had the power to act. Not the councils. The councils were a body, and bodies cannot keep secrets, and a plan like hers died the instant it was spoken aloud in a room with more than a handful of people in it. She needed a single patron, senior enough to command resources and clever enough to recognize that the obvious course was the wrong one. She found him in a fleet admiral named Corin Sae, a man who had opposed the pragmatists not because he thought war was winnable, but because he could not stomach the arithmetic that turned a murdered envoy into an acceptable loss. Sae was not a young man, and he knew it, and he had the particular clarity of a person who understands that his own era is ending and is looking, half in hope and half in dread, for whoever will inherit the problem he cannot solve. When Kessa Orden requested a private audience through the one contact she trusted, Sae granted it mostly out of curiosity, expecting a grieving junior officer with a grievance. What he got was something else. She did not begin with rage. She began with a question. "Admiral," she said, standing in his private office with her hands open at her sides in an echo of a gesture she did not consciously remember, "why did they broadcast it?" Sae frowned. "To humiliate us." They could have humiliated us privately. They could have sent the courier home dark, with no recording, and let us imagine the worst. Instead, they told 200 worlds to watch. Why? Because they're arrogant. Yes, Kessa said, but arrogance is a symptom, sir, not a strategy. Think about what the broadcast was for. It wasn't for us. We were never the audience. The audience was their 200 subject worlds. The whole point of killing our envoy the way they did was to remind everyone who is ruled by the Dominion that the Dominion cannot be answered. That is the message. That is the product they were selling to their own empire. And the moment you see that the broadcast was aimed at their subjects and not at us, everything changes, because it means their power lives in the same place their message lives. It lives in what their subjects believe. And belief, Admiral, is the one kind of fortress you don't need a bigger fleet to breach. Corin Sae was quiet for a long moment. He was old enough to have heard a great many young officers explain their theories of everything, and he had learned to let most of them wash over him. But he had also learned to recognize the rare occasions when someone in front of him was saying a true thing that no one else had said, and the recognition felt, as it always felt, like the temperature of the room dropping. He gestured for her to continue. She continued for 4 hours. When she left his office, it was very late, and Corin Sae did not sleep either, and in the morning he began, quietly, to divert resources to a project that officially did not exist. The second thing Kessa needed was information, and not the kind that fleets gather. She needed the Dominion's private anatomy, the fault lines beneath the black glass, the rivalries in the court of Uthras Vo, the identities of the officers whose loyalty was load-bearing, and the identities of those whose loyalty was merely convenient. An empire held together by belief is also, necessarily, held together by a great many people who do not believe and have simply calculated that saying so is not worth their lives. Those people are the seams. And to find the seams, Kessa needed to talk to the only beings in the galaxy who understood the Dominion from the inside, and hated it from the inside, the subject worlds. This was the part that would have horrified the councils, and it was the part Kessa pursued most patiently of all. For every one of the Dominion's 200 worlds there were exiles, refugees, the survivors of conquests 2 and 3 generations gone who had scattered into the dark carrying their grievances like heirlooms. Humanity, in its brief galactic youth, had taken many of them in without ever quite understanding what it had acquired. Kessa understood. She began to seek them out, not as a fleet officer, not as an agent of Earth, but as one grieving person to another, which was the only credential that mattered to people whose grief was older than her species' presence in the stars. She learned their languages, or enough of them. She listened, which was the thing Aris Halden had been chosen for, and which she had learned to do in the same school that had made him. And slowly, from 1,000 fragments carried by 1,000 exiles, she began to assemble a map of the Dominion that no human fleet had ever possessed. A map not of where the Veil were strong, but of where they were believed. The third thing she needed was the hardest, and it was time. Because Kessa Orden understood from the very first that the reckoning she was building could not be rushed, and that the pressure to rush it would be immense and would come from the best people for the best reasons. Grief wants to be discharged. A wounded species wants to strike back while the wound is fresh, because a fresh wound feels like strength, and a healed one feels like forgetting. But a plan aimed at belief cannot be executed in the white heat of the injury. It requires the enemy to relax. It requires the Dominion to conclude, over months and then years, that humanity had absorbed the blow and swallowed it and gone quiet, that the murdered Envoy had, in the end, cost the Veil nothing, exactly as Uthras Vo had predicted. The plan required the Dominion to be proven right about humanity, publicly and at length, so that when the reckoning came it would arrive into a mind that had stopped watching for it. It required patience of a kind that grief actively fights against. So the second front of Kessa's long campaign was fought at home, and its objective was to make humanity appear to give up. This was, in some ways, the cruelest part, and she felt the cruelty of it every day. Because it meant that while she and Corin SAE and the small silent apparatus they assembled worked toward the reckoning, the public face of humanity had to be one of retreat. The councils, never told the truth, drifted toward the endurance the pragmatists had always counseled. The feeds carried stories of a species learning to live in the shadow of a power it could not challenge. Statues went up to Aris Halden, mourning statues, the kind you build for a loss you have accepted. And out among the 200 worlds, the Dominion's officers noted with satisfaction that the humans had done exactly what lesser species always did. They had grieved, and they had bowed their heads, and they had gone back to being small. The broadcast had worked. Uthras Vo, when the reports reached his throne of swallowed sovereigns, is said to have felt nothing at all, which was the point. He had already stopped thinking about humanity. To think about a thing is to grant it a portion of your fear, and the sovereign of the Veil did not fear a species that had proven it could be made to kneel with a single box. Every one of those reports, when Kessa's exiles brought word of them back to her, she received as good news. Each one was a brick in the wall she was building around the Dominion's attention. Each one made the eventual reckoning more certain and more total. She kept a private record of the Dominion's growing complacency, and she watched it grow, and the colder part of her, the part that had been set into its new shape in the docking bay, understood that she was not merely tolerating humanity's apparent surrender. She was manufacturing it. She was making the veil's own contempt into the ground she would stand on. There were nights it nearly broke her. She was young, and the young feel the gap between what a thing looks like and what it is more sharply than the old do, because they have not yet grown the calluses. She would walk the corridors of Meridian and pass the mourning statue they had placed there, a rendering of Aris Halden with his hands open, and she would want to scream at the people quietly laying flowers at its base that they did not understand, that the surrender they mourned was a lie, that the man in the gray case was going to be answered in a coin the veil could not yet imagine. She never said it. Saying it would have made it smaller and would have ended it, and she had promised the dead man the whole of it. So she laid her own flower at the base of the statue, like everyone else, and she let them think she had made her peace, and she went back to her quarters and worked. Corin Sae watched her do this for a year, and then 2, and something in him that had gone cold with age warmed back to life, in the presence of a resolve that made his own long career look like a rehearsal. He gave her more than resources in the end. He gave her cover, the bureaucratic camouflage that let a project which did not exist consume the labor of hundreds without ever appearing on any manifest. He gave her his authority, spent quietly and deniably, so that when doors needed to open for a strategic officer who by rank should not have been able to open them, they opened. And once, late in the second year, when the Endurance faction in the councils came very close to formalizing humanity's surrender into treaty language that would have made any future reckoning an act of unprovoked aggression, it was Corin Sae who found a way to stall it, buying Kessa the time she needed with a maneuver that cost him what remained of his reputation among his peers. He did not tell her the price he had paid. She found out later, and she never forgot it, and it became one of the small private accounts she carried into the reckoning alongside the Great One. By the third year, the map was nearly complete. Kessa Orden spread it out, in the secure compartment that C's authority had carved out of Meridian's lower decks, and she looked at the whole anatomy of the sovereign dominion of the Veil laid bare, and for the first time she let herself see not just the crack but the exact fracture pattern, the precise sequence of pressures that would run a break clean through the black glass and leave the guilty standing, exposed, while the innocent went free. It was beautiful in the way that only a true thing is beautiful, and it was terrible, and it was hers. The dominion, she had come to understand, was not one thing. It was 3, layered like the rings of something that had grown outward from a rotten core. At the center were the Veil themselves, not all of them guilty. She was careful about this from the very beginning, careful in a way that would matter enormously at the end. But the ruling caste of them, the court and the war officers and the machinery of sovereign Uthras Vo, the specific beings who had made the choice to kill an envoy for sport and broadcast it as policy. That was the guilty power. That was the target. The whole moral architecture of the reckoning depended on Kessa's ability to draw the line between that guilty core and everything around it, and to keep the line exact even when it would have been so much easier to blur it. Around the guilty core was the second ring, the vast apparatus of the Dominion's own species and servants who were not the decision-makers but who executed the decisions. The fleet crews, the administrators, the ordinary functionaries who kept 200 worlds in their chains not out of malice but out of the ordinary human, or veil, or whatever, capacity to do terrible things while looking at a screen. Kessa did not consider these beings innocent. But she did not consider them the target either. They were, she came to see, the load-bearing belief itself made flesh, the millions who obeyed because they could not imagine the Dominion losing. Turned their belief and the Dominion fell without their deaths. That was the whole insight. That was the difference between a war and what she was going to do. And around that second ring was the third, the 200 subject worlds, the conquered, the ones in whose name the reckoning would ultimately be justified even though they would never be asked, and most of them would never know how close deliverance had come until it had already arrived. They were not a target. They were the reason. Kessa kept a list of their names in the secure compartment, all 200, and she read it sometimes the way other people read prayers, to remind herself what the cold thing inside her was for. 3 rings, 1 target, and running between them, threaded through every layer, the invisible tension that held the whole structure up, the belief that it could not fall. Kessa Orden looked at all of it, and she picked up her stylus, and beside the diagram of the guilty core she wrote the sequence of moves that would, in the fullness of time, teach the sovereign of the veil the word he had forgotten. There were 11 moves. She had checked them against the map 100 times. Each one was a small thing, precise and deniable, and taken alone, almost trivial. It was only in sequence, only when the 11 were laid one atop another in exactly the right order and exactly the right rhythm, that they became the things she had promised the dead man they would become. She looked at the 11 moves for a long time. And then, because a thing needs a name before you can wield it, and because she wanted the name to be a message the veil would eventually understand, she wrote at the top of the page the words that the enemy's own broadcast had put into her mind 3 years before, on the day she stood in the docking bay and watched a laughing sovereign teach her what fear was. She called it the Annihilation Protocol. It was not, and never would be, what that name promised. It would annihilate exactly one thing, and it would do it so precisely that when it was over, the galaxy would spend a generation arguing about whether humanity had committed the greatest atrocity in its history or the greatest act of restraint. That argument, too, Kessa had planned for. She wanted the name to sound like the end of the world, because she wanted Uthras Vo, in the moment he finally understood, to believe for one heartbeat that his whole species was about to die, to feel, at last and all at once, the fear he had forgotten how to feel. And then she wanted him to watch it not happen to anyone but him and his. She wanted him to understand that humanity had held the power to annihilate the veil entire in its open hand, and had chosen, with terrible deliberation, to close that hand around only the guilty. That was the reckoning, not the death of a people, the death of a certainty and of the specific creatures who had built their throne on it. She rolled up the map. She had a war to lose in public for another year before she could win it in private. And she went back to work. The first move of the Annihilation Protocol did not look like an attack. It looked like a gift. 4 years after the murder of Aris Halden, a merchant consortium of no particular distinction, humanly owned, but buried under so many shell registrations that no auditor would ever trace it to Earth, began to trade in the outer markets of the Dominion. The Veil permitted such trade in a narrow band, tolerating the lesser species who brought them curiosities and luxuries, the way a great house tolerates the tradesmen at its service door. The consortium dealt in data. Specifically, it dealt in the one commodity that a paranoid empire can never have enough of and can never fully trust: intelligence about its own subject worlds, rumors of unrest, whispers of sedition, the names of agitators, the locations of illegal gatherings, the slow accumulating pressure of 200 conquered peoples who had never stopped hating their conquerors. The intelligence the consortium sold was accurate. This was the crucial thing, and it was the thing that took Kessa Orden 3 years of building her map to make possible. She could sell the Dominion true information about the subject worlds because her exiles had given her more of it than the Veil's own spies possessed. Every report the consortium delivered checked out. Every warning proved founded. And so, over months, the Dominion's internal security apparatus came to rely on this obscure human-adjacent consortium as a source, and then as a valued source, and then, because an empire that cannot feel fear also cannot feel suspicion in the ordinary way, as a trusted one. The Veil did not wonder why a species they had humbled would sell them the tools of their own oppression. They assumed it was greed. Greed they understood. Greed was proof that the humans had been put back in their place. The consortium was Kessa's channel. Everything the protocol would eventually do to the Dominion would travel down the pipe she had spent 4 years laying, the pipe of a trusted supplier of true things. because that was the deepest principle of the whole design, the thing she had understood in the docking bay and had never once let go of. You do not defeat a power that believes in itself by lying to it. You defeat it by telling it the truth in exactly the order that destroys it. The veil would never catch the protocol in a lie, because there would not be any lies. There would only be true things, delivered to the right minds at the right moments, arranged into a pattern the Dominion's own certainty prevented it from seeing. The second move was to make the Dominion afraid of the wrong thing. For decades, the court of HFY had governed its subject worlds through a doctrine its own strategists called the long silence, the principle that unrest, if ignored, exhausts itself, and that the appearance of ceaseless calm is worth more than the reality of it. The subject worlds were kept quiet not by responding to their grievances, but by refusing to acknowledge that grievances existed. A Veil governor who reported unrest was a Veil governor who had failed to prevent it, and so unrest, everywhere in the Dominion, was systematically underreported, buried, denied. The whole empire ran on the comfortable fiction that the conquered were content. Kessa's consortium began, very gently, to make that fiction untenable. Not by fabricating unrest, she never fabricated anything, but by reporting the real unrest that the Dominion's own governors were hiding. The true things. The consortium's reports began to reach the central security apparatus with details the governors had suppressed, and the central apparatus, comparing the consortium's accurate warnings against its governor's serene assurances, began to conclude that its governors were lying to it, which they were. They always had been. The long silence had always been a structure of mutual deception, every layer lying upward to the layer above. Kessa had not created the rot. She had merely turned on a light. The effect was slow and then not slow at all. The court of HFY, presented with mounting evidence that its provincial governors had been concealing the true state of the Dominion for a generation, did what a fearless power does when it finally has something to fear. It turned on itself. Governors were recalled and interrogated. Whole administrative castes fell under suspicion. The war officers, sensing weakness in the civil administration, moved to expand their own authority, and the civil administration moved to defend itself. And the ancient rivalries that Kessa had mapped so carefully, the rivalries every empire carries in its body like old fractures, began, under the new pressure, to open. She had not needed to divide the Dominion against itself. She had only needed to remove the fiction that had let its division stay quiet. The veil did the rest. And through all of it, the consortium kept selling true things, and the central apparatus kept trusting it more, because in a court suddenly full of liars, the one source that had never once been wrong shone like the only honest voice in the room. Kessa had made humanity's catspaw into the most trusted intelligence source in the Dominion. She had done it with the truth. And no one, not one Veil in the entire vast machinery of the empire, suspected that the honest broker at the center of their unraveling was the species they had humbled with a box 4 years before. Corin Sae, watching the reports come in, said to her once, in the secure compartment, "You understand that this is the most dangerous game anyone has ever played. If they ever trace the consortium—" "They won't," Kessa said. "Not because we've hidden it well, though we have. They won't trace it because tracing it would require them to imagine that we're capable of it, and they can't. That's the whole weapon, Admiral. Their contempt is a blindfold they tied on themselves. As long as we never do anything that forces them to take it off, as long as every move looks like something a small, beaten, greedy species might plausibly do, they'll keep looking at their own governors and their own war officers and never once look at us." She paused. "The moment they see us is the moment we've lost. So we don't let them see us until the very end, until it's the last thing they'll ever see." By the 5th year, the Dominion's internal purges had cost it more capable administrators than any war humanity could have waged. By the 6th, the subject world's sensing, in the way the conquered always sense such things, that the great weight pressing down on them had begun to shift, had grown quietly, dangerously restless, and the Dominion, distracted by its own internal bleeding, had less attention than ever to spare for them. Kessa watched the pressure build across her map like weather. She did not release it, not yet. A reckoning released too early is only a riot. She was building something that could not be answered, and that meant building it all the way, to the point where the release would be not a spasm but an avalanche, unstoppable once begun, because every part of it would already be leaning. The middle moves of the protocol were the hardest to watch from the outside, because from the outside they looked like nothing. They looked like a human junior officer, now in her early 30s, promoted slowly and unremarkably, working a series of unglamorous strategic postings while the galaxy forgot her name if it had ever known it. She did not rise fast. Rising fast draws attention, and attention was the one thing the whole enterprise could not afford. She let herself remain minor. She let the councils continue to believe that humanity had accepted its place. She attended once a memorial for Aris Halden on the anniversary of his death, a public event, 10 years on now, a smaller crowd than in the early years, the grief long since faded into ritual, and she stood at the back and listened to a council speaker describe the murdered Envoy as a symbol of the peace humanity would always seek even in the face of cruelty. And she felt the cold thing inside her turn over once, slowly, like something breathing in its sleep. Peace. They had made him a symbol of peace. They did not know that his death was, at that very moment, running down 11 moves of a plan that would rearrange the galaxy. They did not know that the quiet woman at the back of the room had spent a decade turning their murdered symbol of peace into the most exact instrument of justice any species had ever built. She let them keep their symbol. It was truer than they knew, in a way they would not understand for another few years. The reckoning she was building was, in the deepest sense, an act of peace, the establishment of a galaxy in which envoys could no longer be murdered for sport, purchased at the price of exactly the creatures who had committed the murder and no one else. She was making a peace so precise it would look, to the untrained eye, exactly like war. The 7th move brought the war officers into the trap. Of the 3 rings of the Dominion, the war officers were the ones Kessa had studied longest, because they were the most dangerous and the most necessary. They commanded the fleets. If the reckoning was to leave the subject worlds unharmed and the ordinary functionaries alive, it had to neutralize the fleets without fighting them, because a fighting fleet, even a losing one, kills. Kessa had no intention of winning a war against the Dominion's fleets. She intended to make sure they never fired. And to do that she had to reach the officers who commanded them, and offer them something that no conqueror in the history of the galaxy had ever been offered by the species it had wronged. She offered them a future. This was the 7th move, and it was the one that separated the Annihilation Protocol from mere vengeance, and it was the one that Core and SAE had argued against the longest, because it required trusting the enemy, or a portion of the enemy, and SAE had spent his whole life learning not to. But Kessa had seen something in her map that SAE, for all his experience, had not. She had seen that the war officers of the Veil were not, most of them, believers in Uthras Vo. They were pragmatists in armor. They served the sovereign because the sovereign held power, and they had watched over 6 years as that power ate itself from the inside, and they had begun, quietly, individually, in the privacy of minds that showed nothing on the surface, to calculate. An officer whose empire is devouring its own administrators and turning on its own castes is an officer who has begun, whether he admits it or not, to wonder what comes after. And a being who is wondering what comes after is a being who can be reached. The consortium reached them, not with bribes. Bribes are cheap and buy cheap loyalty. With truth, again, always the truth. The consortium began discreetly to let certain war officers understand that they were seen. That the eventual collapse of Uthras Vo's regime was not a possibility but a certainty, engineered and inevitable, and that when it came, there would be 2 kinds of Veil war officers. Those who had chosen, in advance, to be part of what came after, and those who had gone down with the throne of swallowed sovereigns because they lacked the imagination to picture their own survival. The consortium did not ask them to betray anything. It only asked them to understand. And understanding, once planted in a pragmatic mind, does its own quiet work. Kessa did not know in those years how many of the war officers she had turned. She could not know. The whole point of reaching them through implication rather than agreement was that no one on either side ever said the incriminating thing aloud. She was not building a conspiracy of allies. She was building a shared understanding, a distributed, deniable, unspoken consensus among the Dominion's most dangerous servants that when the moment came, the smart move would be to stand aside. She was manufacturing in the very hearts of the fleets the one thing that could make them fail without firing: doubt. Belief was the fortress. Doubt was the water rising in its cellars. By the 8th year, everything was in place except the trigger, and the trigger was the part Kessa had thought about longest of all, because the trigger was the part that had to be public. Everything up to this point had happened in the dark. The consortium, the truths, the doubt seated in the war officers, the purges the Dominion had inflicted on itself. None of it could be seen, but the reckoning itself, the moment of unveiling, had to be seen by everyone. It had to be seen by the 200 subject worlds, so that they would rise at the right moment and not a day before. It had to be seen by the war officers, so that the unspoken consensus would resolve all at once into stillness. And above all, it had to be seen by Uthras-Vo, on his throne of swallowed sovereigns, because the entire 11-move architecture existed for a single purpose that Kessa had never once lost sight of across 10 years of patience. It existed to teach one being the word he had forgotten. And a lesson unwitnessed by its pupil is not a lesson. It is only a loss. So the last 3 moves of the Annihilation Protocol were not about tearing the Dominion down. The Dominion, by the 10th year, was already leaning so far into its own fractures that a hard push would topple it. The last 3 moves were about arranging the fall so that Uthras-Vo would see it coming, understand exactly what it was and who had built it and why, and have precisely enough time to feel the thing humanity had crossed the galaxy to give him, and then not enough time to do anything about it. Kessa Orden was 36 years old when she finished laying the trigger. She had spent 10 years on it. She had lost the fresh grief and kept the cold thing it had become. She had watched Korin Sae grow old and frail in the service of a plan he would not live to see completed. She had let the galaxy forget her and let her own species believe it had surrendered, and she had never once, in all that time, spoken the dead man's promise aloud. Now it was ready. Now the whole vast machine she had built in silence stood balanced on a single point, and all that remained was to lean. She went to see Korin Sae one last time before she gave the order. He was dying by then, quietly, in the way of men who have spent themselves on something larger than their own lives, and he knew it, and he had refused every treatment that would have kept him alive past the thing he wanted to see. She sat by him in the secure compartment that his authority had carved out of Meridian a decade before, and she told him it was ready, and she watched the old fear leave his face, the fear that he would die before the answer came. "Tell me it will be exact," he said. His voice was very thin now. "Tell me we're not just going to become them. Tell me we drew the line and we're going to hold it." "We drew the line," Kessa said, "and we're going to hold it. Every guilty one of them, not one soul more. I have spent 10 years making sure of the not one soul more, Admiral. That's the whole reckoning. Anyone can burn a world. We're going to do something the galaxy has never seen. We're going to be precise." Korin Sae closed his eyes. "Then do it," he said. "And when it's done, when he understands, I want you to remember that a man who's dying told you this was the right thing. Because you're going to spend the rest of your life being told it wasn't. They'll say you should have burned them all, and they'll say you should have burned none of them, and they'll never understand that the whole point was the line. Hold the line, Kessa. Whatever they say after, you held it for the right reason." She held his hand until it was over. Then she went to give the order that 10 years and one murdered envoy had been building toward, and she gave it in a voice that did not shake, because she had learned a long time ago in a docking bay how to make her voice not shake. She said, "Begin the unveiling." The unveiling began, as Kessa had designed it to begin, with a single broadcast, because the whole thing had started with a broadcast, and she wanted the symmetry, and more than the symmetry she wanted the veil to feel the shape of what was happening close around them like a hand. It went out to 200 worlds at once, on the same channels the Dominion had used 10 years before to show the galaxy what it did to humanity's envoy. Kessa's people had spent months acquiring the access. The war officers who had quietly decided to stand aside had made the last of it possible, though none of them had ever said a word that could be called treason. The broadcast carried no fleet behind it, no ultimatum, no threat. It carried a single recording, and the recording was of Aris Halden. Not his death. The Dominion had made his death into their message, and Kessa refused to answer a message with the same message. What she broadcast was his life. The last words he had spoken in the throne room of Uthras Vo before the honor guard closed around him. "My people did not send me because we are weak. They sent me because we hoped you were strong enough not to need this. I am sorry for what my death is going to cost you. It will cost you more than you can possibly imagine." And then, beneath his open-handed face, 3 words appeared in every language the Dominion ruled. He was right. That was the entire first broadcast. No demands, no signature. Nothing to trace, nothing to answer, nothing to strike back against. Just a dead man's prophecy and a promise that it had come true. To the court of Uthras Vo it was an irritation, a piece of theater from a species long since put in its place. They ordered it suppressed. They could not suppress it. That was the point of 10 years of quiet work. The channels were open in ways the Dominion no longer fully controlled, and the war officers who might have closed them found reasons not to, and the broadcast played and replayed across 200 worlds, while the central apparatus discovered, to its slow horror, that it could not make the words stop. To the subject worlds, the broadcast meant something else entirely. It meant that the thing they had felt for 6 years, the shifting of the great weight, the quiet unraveling of the power that held them, had a shape and a direction and now a voice. It meant that someone was answering the Dominion, and a conquered people who have never once seen their conqueror answered will, at the first true sign of it, feel something they had forgotten was possible. Not hope exactly. Something colder and more useful than hope. Certainty. The certainty that the unanswerable had, at last, been answered. Kessa had timed the broadcast for the exact moment. The map told her the subject worlds were most ready, and the Dominion least able to respond, and she had built into it a second layer that only the war officers would understand. A set of signals, buried in the recording structure, that told the ones who had quietly decided to stand aside that the moment they had been waiting for had arrived, and that the smart move, the move that put them on the right side of what came after, was to do nothing at all. To keep their fleets in port, to find, each of them, some plausible reason why their guns should stay cold on this particular day. She was not asking them to fight for humanity. She had never asked that. She was asking them to fail to fight for Uthras Vo, and to make the failure look like anything other than what it was. And they did. This was the part that the galaxy would argue about for a generation, because it was the part that made no sense unless you understood the 10 years beneath it. When the subject worlds rose, and they rose almost as one, in the days after the broadcast, 200 conquered peoples throwing off a certainty that had held them for centuries, the Dominion's fleets did not descend upon them in the great cleansing fire that doctrine demanded. They hesitated. They found their orders unclear, their command structures snarled by the purges the Dominion had inflicted on itself, their officers strangely unable to agree on who had the authority to give the word. Whole battle groups sat in their berths while their sovereign screamed for them to burn the rebellious worlds, and the officers looked at the screaming and looked at the unraveling around them, and made the calculation Kessa had spent 6 years teaching them to make. They stood aside, not out of mercy, out of the pragmatic understanding, planted so patiently that each of them believed he had arrived at it alone, that a fleet which burned 200 worlds for a dying regime would answer for it to whatever regime came next. The doubt Kessa had seated in the fortress had risen to the ceiling, and a fleet full of doubt is a fleet that does not fire. It is important to understand what Kessa did not do in these days, because the not doing was the whole moral spine of the reckoning, and she had built the not doing as carefully as anything else. She did not attack the fleets. She did not bombard Ashvar. She did not turn the risen subject worlds into a weapon aimed at the ordinary Veil, the second ring, the millions of functionaries and crews who had kept the Dominion running without ever choosing to. When the subject worlds rose, there were places where the old hatreds threatened to boil over into slaughter of the conqueror's civilians, and Kessa's people were there. The exiles she had spent 10 years befriending now returned to their homeworlds as the only humans the risen peoples trusted, and they held the line. They had been prepared for exactly this. Kessa had known from the first year that the greatest danger to the exactness of her reckoning was not the Dominion's strength, but the victim's rage, that a liberation could curdle into a massacre in an afternoon, that the line she had promised Corin Sae she would hold could be lost not by her enemies but by her friends. So she had built, alongside the machinery of the Dominion's fall, the machinery of its restraint. Her exiles carried her promise into the rising, freedom, yes, vengeance against the guilty, yes, but not this, not the burning of ordinary people for the crimes of a court. That way lay becoming the thing they were overthrowing. It held, not everywhere, not perfectly, no line drawn across the fury of 200 liberations holds perfectly, but it held far better than any liberation in the galaxy's history had held, and it held because a young human strategist had understood, 10 years before, that the hardest part of a reckoning is not destroying the guilty, but sparing everyone else. The subject worlds threw off the Dominion. They did not, in the main, drown their former masters in blood. And the ordinary Veil, the second ring, discovered something that would remake their species in the aftermath. That the humans who had orchestrated the fall of everything they knew had also, quietly and at great cost, arranged for them to survive it. That fact would do more to end the Dominion's certainty than any fleet ever could. You cannot rebuild an empire of terror among a people who have just been spared by the ones they were taught to despise. And in the throne room on Ashvar, Uthras Vo watched his galaxy come apart, and he began at last to feel it. It came to him slowly, because he had been so long without it that he did not at first recognize what it was. The reports arriving at his throne of swallowed sovereigns made no sense to a mind that had forgotten how to be afraid. Worlds in rebellion that had happened before and doctrine handled it, but the fleets not responding, the war officers finding reasons, the channels he could not close, the dead human's face on 200 worlds with 3 words beneath it. Each report alone was survivable. It was the pattern that undid him, the growing, undeniable pattern of a thing that had been built, deliberately, over years and aimed at him, and was now closing. Uthras Vo had spent his whole long reign unable to conceive of being answered. And now the answer was all around him, in every screen, in the silence where his fleets should have been. And his mind, which had no practice at this, which had let the muscle of fear atrophy across centuries of unchallenged rule, began, for the first time, to work the way a cornered mind works. He ordered investigations. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find that his certainty had not already prevented him from seeing. He ordered arrests. He arrested the wrong beings, always the wrong beings, because the whole architecture of the reckoning had been designed so that a mind like his, looking for the enemy, would look everywhere except at the small beaten species it had humbled with a box. He turned on his own court, because a fearless power's first instinct when it finally feels fear is to look inward, and the court, already half shattered by 6 years of purges, turned on him in return. The throne of swallowed sovereigns, which had eaten 9 rulers before him, began to eat the 10th, and it did so exactly on the schedule Kessa Orden had drawn in a secure compartment years before, because she had understood the throne better than the being sitting on it. But she was not finished. The fall of the Dominion was the 8th, 9th, and 10th moves. The 11th move, the last one, the one the whole thing had been built to deliver, was not the fall. It was the lesson, and a lesson requires that the pupil understand it. Kessa had not spent 10 years merely to topple Uthras Vo. Regimes toppled all the time. The galaxy was littered with the corpses of fallen powers, and their falling taught no one anything, because the ones who fell rarely understood why. Kessa wanted more than his fall. She wanted his comprehension. She wanted the sovereign of the Veil to know, in full, before the end, exactly what had been done to him and by whom and for what, so that the last thing to pass through his ancient certain mind would be the word he had made her learn. So she went to Ashvar. Korin Sae would have forbidden it if he had lived. It was the single most dangerous act in the entire 10-year campaign, and it violated every principle of deniability she had built the reckoning upon. But Korin Sae was dead, and Kessa had made this decision alone a long time ago, in the private place where she kept the dead man's promise, and she had never intended to let anyone talk her out of it. The reckoning had been faceless by necessity for 10 years. It could not end faceless. Aris Halden had walked into the throne room of Uthras Vo alone and unarmed and open-handed, and had been murdered for it. And Kessa Orden intended to walk into that same throne room the same way, alone and unarmed and open-handed, and to survive it, not because she was stronger than Aris had been, but because the galaxy had changed shape beneath the sovereign's feet, and the throne room he ruled from was no longer a place where he could kill whoever he pleased. She came the way Aris had come, a single unarmed courier, Earth's blue mark on the hull. She let them see exactly what it was, and she let the symbolism do its work, because by now every Veil who saw that little blue-marked ship knew the last time one had come, and knew what the Dominion had done to it, and knew this was the thing. This was the whole terrible arithmetic of the moment, that the galaxy was very different now, and that whatever answer they made to this second courier would be made in front of 200 risen worlds, and a fleet full of officers who had already decided to stand aside. The honor guard that met her did not close around her. That, more than anything, told her she had won. 10 years before, they had closed around Aris Halden without a flicker of doubt, because there had been nothing in the galaxy to make them doubt. Now they hesitated, and their hesitation was the visible surface of the doubt she had spent a decade sinking into the foundations of the Dominion, and she walked between them with her hands open at her sides and her back straight and her voice. When she finally used it, steady, because she had learned in a docking bay how to make her voice steady over the very worst thing she had ever seen. She walked into the throne room of Uthras Vo, and the sovereign of the Veil, who had forgotten how to be afraid, looked down from his throne of swallowed sovereigns at the small, warm-blooded thing that Earth had sent, and for the first time in his long life, he was. The fear that came into Uthras Vo was not the clean, sharp fear of a soldier facing a gun. It was worse than that, because it was old and clumsy and had no shape, the fear of a creature encountering something for which its whole life had left it unprepared. He looked at the human woman standing open-handed in his ruined court, and some ancient part of him understood before his mind did. He had seen this before. He had seen a small, warm-blooded thing walk into this hall with open hands, and he had laughed, and he had killed it, and he had broadcast the killing to 200 worlds as a promise that the Dominion could not be answered. And now the answer was standing in front of him. "You," he said, and his voice no longer filled the hall the way water fills a drowning man's lungs, because the hall was half empty now, its courtiers fled or arrested or turned, and a voice needs a court to fill. "You are the one who did this." "My name is Kessa Orden," she said. The translators rendered her words a half-second behind her lips, exactly as they had rendered the dead man's. I was on watch the day you sent him home. I opened the box, Sovereign. I saw what you left in it, and I made him a promise. Uthras Vo's certainty made one last attempt to save him. It was all he had ever known. It did not die easily. You have destroyed nothing, he said. The veil endure. My worlds rebel, worlds have rebelled before. My fleets are scattered, fleets regroup. You have inconvenienced an empire that will outlast your entire species by 10,000 years. If you came here to gloat, human, you have miscalculated. If you came here to threaten me, I will show you again what the Dominion does to those who... I didn't come to threaten you, Kessa said. And I didn't come to gloat, I came to explain. Because the whole reason I built this, 10 years of it, Sovereign, 10 years, was so that you would understand it before the end. A death you don't understand teaches no one anything, and I need you to understand this one. So I'm going to tell you exactly what I did to you, and then I'm going to tell you the one thing you never let yourself imagine, and I need you to listen the way he listened to you, before you closed your guard around him. And she told him. She stood in the throne room where humanity's envoy had been murdered, alone and unarmed, and she laid out for the Sovereign of the Veil the entire architecture of his fall. The consortium. The truths, always the truths, never a single lie, because she had wanted him to understand that his empire had been undone not by human deception, but by human honesty deployed with a precision his kind had forgotten was possible. The purges he had inflicted on himself. The doubt she had sunk into his war officers, so patiently that each of them believed he had chosen his own stillness. The exiles she had turned into the keepers of his subjects' restraint. She showed him the 11 moves, one by one, and she watched the terrible comprehension climb across his ancient face, the dawning understanding that everything that had happened to his empire over 6 years had been not chaos, not misfortune, not the ordinary entropy of rule, but a single sustained intention, aimed at him, executed with a patience his species had lost the capacity even to perceive. You did this, he said at last, for one man. One envoy. I did this, Kessa said, because you taught the galaxy that envoys could be murdered for sport, and I decided the galaxy would learn a different lesson. His name was Aris Halden. You never learned it. You killed him and you didn't even learn his name. That's the whole of you, Sovereign. That's the entire disease of you distilled. You couldn't imagine that the thing you stepped on had a name or a people or a memory or the patience to answer you. You couldn't imagine being answered. And a power that can't imagine being answered, can't see the answer coming until it's already here. Uthras Vo was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, some of the arrogance had gone out of him, and what was left underneath it was old and tired and for the first time afraid in a way he could name. Then finish it, he said. You have your fleets in their berths and your 200 worlds risen and your knife at my throat. You called it the Annihilation Protocol. Yes, human, I know what you named it. My last loyal servants brought me that much. So do what the name promises. Annihilate us. Burn Ashvar. End the veil and take your reckoning and be done. And here, at the very end, Kessa Orden did the thing the entire 10 years had been built to make possible. The thing that was the real reckoning, the reckoning beneath the reckoning, the one that would make the galaxy argue about her for a generation. She said no. The word landed in the ruined court like a struck bell. Uthras Vo stared at her. Aim is a lie, Kessa said. I made it a lie on purpose. I named it the Annihilation Protocol because I wanted you to feel, in the moment you finally understood that your whole species was about to die. I wanted you to feel the thing you made me feel in that docking bay, the moment the universe rearranges itself, and you realize the thing you were certain of was never true. I wanted you to taste the annihilation of the veil, and then I wanted you to watch it not happen, because that's the lesson, Sovereign. That's what I crossed the galaxy to teach you. Humanity held the power to annihilate your people, every one of them. Your fleets are cold, your worlds are risen, your court is shattered, and there is nothing standing between the veil and extinction except one human choice. And we chose the line. She stepped closer to the throne of swallowed sovereigns, and she did not lower her open hands. Your ordinary people will live. Your crews, your functionaries, the millions who kept your machine running without ever choosing it, they'll live. And more than live, they'll rebuild. And the thing they rebuild will be something your kind hasn't been in 10,000 years, because they'll do it knowing that the species you humbled with a box is the same species that chose to spare them. Your subject worlds are free, and my people are already there making sure that freedom doesn't become the massacre you'd have made of it. The veil endure, sovereign. You were right about that, just not the way you meant. Then what, Uthresvo said slowly, does your protocol annihilate? You, Kessa said, you and the court that chose the box, the specific creatures who decided that murdering an envoy was policy and broadcast it as pride. Not your species, not your worlds, not the millions who obeyed, just the guilty, sovereign drawn out with a precision your kind forgot was possible and answered for exactly what they did and nothing more. That's the annihilation. It's the smallest one anyone's ever built, and it took 10 years to make it that small because the easy thing, the thing everyone will say I should have done, would have been to burn you all. Anyone can burn a world. I spent a decade learning to burn only what was guilty and spare everything else. That's the reckoning. That's the whole of it. Precision, where you offered a slaughter. The war officers who had stood aside came for Uthresvo then, not humanity's soldiers, but his own, the ones who had made the pragmatic calculation years ago and were now resolving it into action, because the smart move on the far side of the Dominion's fall was to be the ones who delivered the guilty and inherited what came after. Kessa had arranged even this. The reckoning against the Court of the Veil was carried out by the Veil, judged by the Veil, so that it could never be called a human conquest, so that the line she had drawn would be drawn in the Dominion's own hand. She had built a justice the guilty could not survive, and the innocent could not be swept up in, and she had built it so that, when it was done, no one could say humanity had ruled the galaxy for even a single day. Humanity had not come to rule. Humanity had come to answer one murder exactly, and then to go home. Uthresvo, as they took him from the throne of swallowed sovereigns that had eaten 9 before him, and would not eat him because his line ended here, looked at the small human woman one last time. He said it would cost more than I could imagine, the sovereign said. Your envoy, I thought he was begging. He wasn't begging, Kessa said. He was telling you the truth. It's the only thing my people ever did to yours. We just told you the truth in the right order until it was done. Goodbye, sovereign. His name was Aris Halden. I wanted yours to be the last mind that finally learned it. She did not watch what came after. It was not hers to watch, and she had built it that way on purpose, so that the ending of Uthresvo would belong to the ones he had ruled and not to the ones he had wronged. She turned, and she walked back out between the honor guard that had not closed around her, and she boarded the single unarmed courier with Earth's blue mark on the hull, and she went home. The galaxy argued about Kessa Orden for the rest of her life, and long after, exactly as she had known it would. There were those who called her the greatest monster humanity had ever produced, a woman who had spent 10 years engineering the fall of a galactic power in cold blood, who had turned grief into a machine and pointed it at a throne. And there were those who called her the opposite, who said she should have burned the veil entire, that mercy toward the guilty's people was weakness, that a reckoning which spared millions of the conqueror's kind was no reckoning at all. She was too cruel for half the galaxy and too gentle for the other half, and both halves missed the thing entirely, and she let them, because Corin Sae had told her they would on the last night of his life, and had told her to hold the line anyway. She held it. She lived a long time, and she never once explained herself beyond what she had said in the throne room, and she never wrote the memoir the historians begged her for, and she never accepted the honors the councils tried to give her, because she had not done it for honors, and accepting them would have made it smaller. She had promised the whole of it to a dead man, and the whole of it was the reckoning, not the reward. The veil endured, as she had said they would. freed of the court that had ruled them by terror, spared by the species they had been taught to despise. They became, over the generations that followed, something the galaxy had never seen a fallen empire become. A people who had been shown mercy by their own victims and had never quite gotten over it. They built monuments in time, not to Uthras Vo, but to the human woman who had unmade him and let them live. And on the world that had been Ashvar, where the black glass was pulled down and the roofed-over oceans opened again to the sky, they raised a statue of a man with his hands open at his sides. They had learned his name. Everyone learned his name in the end. That had been the whole point. Aris Halden, the envoy humanity sent with open hands, whom the Galactic Empire executed in bad faith, believing a gentle species could be made to kneel with a single box. They were wrong. Humanity did not kneel. Humanity grieved, and then a young woman on watch that night looked into the box and did not look away, and she made a promise, and she spent 10 patient years turning that promise into the most precise instrument of justice the galaxy had ever seen. A protocol named for annihilation that annihilated only the guilty and spared everyone else, and taught an empire that had forgotten how to fear the one word it had made her learn. They called it the Annihilation Protocol. In the end, the only thing it annihilated was the certainty that humanity could be wronged and not answer. And the last mind to learn that lesson, on a throne of swallowed sovereigns, at the hands of a woman with her open hands still open, had 31 years too late finally learned the name of the man he had killed for sport. In the years after, the councils of humanity tried more than once to understand what Kessa Orden had actually built, and each time they came away with a different answer, and none of the answers were wrong and none of them were complete. The military historians studied the 11 moves and pronounced them a masterwork of asymmetric strategy, a campaign that had toppled a galactic power without humanity firing a single shot, that had spent 10 years and almost no lives to unmake an empire of 200 worlds. The moral philosophers studied the line she had drawn between the guilty and the spared, and argued endlessly about whether such a line could ever truly be held, whether the millions of ordinary veil she had chosen not to punish had really been innocent or merely convenient to spare. And the ordinary people of Earth, the 11 billion in whose name an envoy had carried an open hand into the dark, understood it in the simplest and truest way of all, that a young woman had refused on their behalf to become the thing that had wronged them. Kessa herself, when she was very old, was asked by a young officer, younger than she had been in the docking bay, how she had held to the plan across 10 years when every instinct must have screamed to strike sooner, to strike harder, to burn the ones who had earned burning. And she was quiet for a while, the way Corin Sae had been quiet before her, and then she said the thing she had never put in any record. Because grief wants to be a fire, she said, and I decided to make it a blade instead. A fire burns everything it touches, the guilty and the innocent, the enemy and yourself. It feels like strength while it's burning and it leaves you with ash. But a blade only cuts what you point it at. A blade takes 10 years to forge and a lifetime to aim, and it requires you to stay cold when everyone around you is on fire, and it costs you every easy comfort of vengeance. I didn't want the ash. I wanted the cut. I wanted to reach past 200 worlds and millions of ordinary lives and take out exactly the throat that deserved it and leave everything else standing. Anyone can burn. It takes a decade of grief held in your open hand to cut that clean. She looked at the young officer, and something of the docking bay was still in her eyes even then, even after all the years. He walked in with open hands. I made sure the answer to that was not a closed fist. It was open hands too, holding a blade. That was the whole difference. That was the reckoning. Don't ever let anyone tell you the open hand was weakness. It was the strongest thing my people ever did. It just took us 10 years to prove it. The young officer wrote it down. It became, in time, one of the few things Kessa Orden ever said that survived her, and it was carved, eventually, beneath the statue on the world that had been Ashvar, beside the older statue of the man with his open hands, the two of them facing each other across a plaza where the black glass had once climbed until the horizon curdled with it. The envoy who had offered peace and been murdered for it, and the strategist who had answered the murder with a justice so precise it had spared a whole species, while ending exactly the ones who had earned their ending. Between them, in the language the Veil had once used to rule 200 worlds by terror, and in the language of Earth, and in a dozen languages of the freed, ran the three words that had gone out to the galaxy on the first day of the unveiling, the words that had been a dead man's prophecy and had become a living woman's promise kept. He was right. And beneath those, smaller, the name that the sovereign of the Veil had learned too late, the name that 10 years and one impossible act of restraint had finally taught the galaxy to remember. Aris Halden, who went out with open hands and did not go unanswered,